Hey everyone, I'm Cody.
And I'm Brent.
And we are the Hugonauts, here to review and discuss for you the best science fiction novels of all time. This week we are reviewing the Foundation trilogy by Isaac Asimov. Just the trilogy, not the later books, since there's such a big time gap between when they were written. And, you know, as always, make sure you like, subscribe if you're watching us on YouTube, or download follow if you're just listening, especially so you don't miss our very special next episode that we are super excited about.
So excited.
Interview with David Brin, the multiple Hugo and Nebula award-winning author of Startide Rising, among others. He's kind of the progenitor of Uplift, or, you know, bringing other species up to humanity's intelligence level. And also kind of one of the first authors to dabble with and bring us the space opera, or at least adapt it to modernity. So we're super stoked to talk with David Brin.
Really looking forward to it. One of the all-time greats. It's going to be fun.
Yeah. So you don't want to miss that one. This week, though, like I said, Foundation trilogy. So let's hear it, Brent. What are we talking about?
Yeah, for sure. So it's 3 books in that original trilogy, written in the late 40s and early 50s. They're all about 270 pages or 9 hours on audiobook. It varies very, very slightly, but they're all very close. And in general, these books are about the decline of the galactic empire. So it's a galactic empire that's ruled the entire galaxy for thousands of years, but it's grown decadent and is in an inevitable decline, which is predicted by one man, this guy Hari Seldon, who invents a thing called psychohistory, which is basically a fusion of math and psychology, today we would say data science, to predict the future. You know, he can predict the lives, predict the behavior of very, very large groups, basically. And so he sees the decline of the empire is inevitable, and he foresees a period of 30,000 years of barbarism after that, where the universe will be a very unhappy place. And so to avoid that, he sends gathers up a bunch of scientists and scholars, the best minds in the galaxy, and sends them to the planet Terminus, this barren world at the edge of the galaxy, to establish the Foundation, which, he says, by its creation will shorten the period of barbarism to 1,000 years instead of 30,000 years. And so then we get to see history unfold through a series of crises that threaten to destroy the Foundation, told over hundreds of years with different characters who, of course, don't live concurrently because the events are so far apart. So we kind of get to see, like, in broad strokes, the history of this galaxy play out. Last thing I'll note is that the first book is called Foundation, the second book is called Foundation and Empire, and the third book is called Second Foundation, which is confusing. But when you're actually reading them, it does make sense in context. But yeah, so Foundation, Empire, then Second Foundation. So that's our setup.
It sure is. You also had another little announcement. You're excited about this project.
Oh, yeah. So social media, I have a lot of books, too many books. There's bookshelves in other rooms too. Anyway, I had a bunch of piles on the floor. Also, it had gotten too much. So I did a purge, and some of what I've got to make room for is new sci-fi stuff. So there's a bunch of old sci-fi books that we're going to be giving away starting by the time this comes out. Actually, I think we'll have done 1 or 2 already on our social media accounts, but on Twitter and Instagram, please do check us out at Hugonauts Pod on Twitter, or at Hugonauts Podcast on Instagram. And yeah, we'll send you, enter to win. We'll send you some sci-fi books if you're in the lower 48. Upcoming ones, I can see the pile right now. Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood. We're going to do The Dark Forest by Cixin Liu. This Immortal by Roger Zelazny, which is hard to find. Anyway, there's a bunch of other ones. It's going to be fun. So yeah, make sure to follow us on social media and then enter to win those so we can send you some books.
Yes. We like books here. We hope you do too.
I got to make room to buy new ones.
This is a weird thing for you to be listening to if you don't read. Anyways, I'm going to begin by giving my review of Foundation, which is overall, I think, the trilogy a 4. Foundation itself, the first book, I think, is approaching a 5, and the other 2 kind of fall off a little bit, but it's not too much of a fall off like we've seen with some other trilogies. They're just really interesting experiments about the soft science meeting the hard science in the kind of overall flow of humanity as society and where we go and what what matters to society building and how it is structured, maintained, and evolves.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I largely agree. This is one where actually I think we have kind of we feel the same way about these books. I'm going to give the trilogy 4 stars. The first book, I'll actually give a 5. I think it's a really tremendous accomplishment. And in general, it's just so interesting to think about this sort of like long-term future vision. How can we make the distant future a much better place? Is, I think, a really interesting thought experiment. It degrades a little bit over the series because the plot gets a little more convoluted and there's a little bit of space magic kind of happening in the third book. But that could be okay, except it doesn't mesh super well with Asimov's writing style, which is very much about like characters sort of arguing back and forth about how to sort of solve rational puzzles. But as the plot gets more convoluted and a little bit less logical, that it just loses a little bit of its charm for me. But I still think the second and third books are fun. I just didn't love them as much as the first, which I really think is like an all-time masterpiece. So yeah, that's my take.
Yeah, I also think, there's something to be said about when we're reading these books, the couple trilogies we've done, we've gone like 1, 2, 3 for either the first time we've read them or like for this and Three Body, we each read the first novel and then we read the first novel again plus the rest of the trilogy. I wonder if it would feel different if you were, obviously it's not as easy with Foundation, but if you were reading one when it came out and then waiting till the next one was published and then waiting till the next one was published, maybe there's also a little bit of fatigue that sets in if you read a trilogy like
maybe
all in 2 weeks.
Yeah, and you can tell not only were these, of course, would these originally have been broken up into 3 separate books, but they also would have been broken up further into pieces in magazines, because these were all originally published in like the old school sci-fi mags. And you can really tell they very much feel sort of like a collection of short stories / novellas, all of which are great on their own, particularly in that first book. I really think all 3, I don't know if it was 3 or 4 magazine publications for that first book, but it was just, they're all so great. And so, it makes them, it almost feels like we're reviewing a short story collection that has like a lot of shared themes. But yeah,
shared themes and also a shared arc, which I thought he did well, which is, in some of the trilogies fall apart because you're like, I just don't care. Like what I was introduced to in the first one is just something that is completely lost by the second and third one. And I think Asimov does a good job here of kind of dropping some mysteries at the beginning in the first half of Foundation, the first book, that arc us all the way through book 3 and bridge in book 2. And then also there's some resolution in book 1. So it's a very nicely paced resolution of mystery as we go.
Yeah, it was really great. It's like, I don't know if he planned it before he wrote the first one or if he just happened to pick a really great premise that it was easy to like continue to build on over time. But either way, works very, very, very well and makes it feel super contiguous. And yeah, the Asimov stories that I've liked the most are very much these like kind of like logic puzzle style. He creates this really interesting world and then he gives you like logic problems within them. Like, how are the characters going to solve this problem? And it almost feels like if you like stopped reading for a minute and sat down and tried to put yourself in the character's shoes, you could figure out the answer. And it's like a really refreshing, usually the books are exciting, so you don't actually do that, but it's really interesting for it to feel that way. And it makes them feel like really real in a cool, interesting way.
Yeah, and maybe that's what's so good, like satisfying about the mystery. Maybe that's just something to say about writing in general, writing mystery, but that it's something that you could, in theory, if it's good enough, it's like something that you're not going to get to necessarily along the way if you're actively reading, but it's something that the details of the mystery are parsed out enough for you that you could, in theory, think of the answer yourself if you worked on it hard enough or you're smart enough. Maybe that's like the sweet spot for a good mystery. He's also like, the other thing he does that so well in his writing is he adds elements that make a plot interesting or make a story interesting without breaking stride. I think I had this one example that I loved in Foundation. Right at the beginning, a character named Gal comes to the planet Trantor, which is the head planet of the galaxy. the Galactic Empire, and he's going to meet with Hari Seldon. And we've been in kind of an omnipresent, omnipotent third-person narrator voice the whole time, seeing what Gal's going through, whatever. And then there's just this one little passage when Gal is going to his hotel, and he uses the same description, and then he says, Asimov uses the same description, and then he says, and that's what the man following him saw. Or the man following him saw Gal get onto the train. Whatever he says, it's just that one little bit that he doesn't break stride at all from the other voice, but he gives you that it's a man following him, watching him. And you all of a sudden there's a little bit of like dread, foreshadowing, anticipation that he just injects in perfect rhythm. So
yeah, it's so good.
I think that's cool. And then his other major writing facet, obviously, is the problems and not problems, but the expository dialogue, right?
Yeah. It's simultaneously like one of his greatest strengths, and when it's not going well, like one of the weaknesses. But yeah, almost all the plot is told through characters talking to each other. You know, they're people. We're basically following the good guys, so it's usually people trying to like figure out a solution to a problem. They don't really know what the other people necessarily are doing, so they're trying to figure that out. How do we get out of this? And that simultaneously makes it feel very real. And when it's good, it's great because you know you're seeing things through their eyes. It really makes the sort of the logic puzzle, the problem, like feel very alive. In the second and the third books, where things start to get a little bit more magical, it feels like there's
fantastical, right?
Yes. It's not magic.
Yeah.
It's
just a little more far-fetched.
Yeah. And the characters are all like, they're almost like all angry at each other. There's like a lot of like yelling at each other, trying to seem like the smartest guy in the room, you know, it's just like is wearing after a while. And the thing they're all trying to figure out is also convoluted, that you're just like, well, this is all such, and I don't know that there was a solution. Just like the plot arc he picked is hard to tell a story with his style. So it's just a little bit of a mismatch.
And I think that makes it sound more extreme than it is. Maybe like I think that's maybe why it gets like a knock from a 5 to a 4 or whatever. It's a lot, like it can get a little dull. But I also think that it matches it. The way you're getting the action of the story through characters discussing what's going on, like what just happened, what's happening concurrently, or what's about to happen, like revealing their little plots to each other and revealing the information they know that's helping their plot. And instead of seeing the action, you know, like the man got on the spaceship and then he turned right and there was an alien, so he shot the gun. There's no aliens in this, but this is my bad example. You're hearing a man talk and say, the man will have gotten on the ship by now, and he'll have turned the corner to shoot the alien, as he's revealing his plot to someone else. And it makes it, the story is so much about politicking and society building and like the ways that people can manipulate society and the soft sciences that that storytelling method parallels the events of this story nicely, I think. So I think that's why it's a nice match here. And I didn't get tired of it in the first book. And like you said, maybe a little bit in the second, third book, but I also think it's the right way to tell the story. And it's just a little knock, not a big one.
I think it's a good illustration of this. Like rereading the first book, I like loved just as much as the first time I read it. The second book was less fun because I already knew the twist. And so I think that was just sort of a testament to the fact that just a little less good, you know, like in theory, even if you know the resolution, a book can still be great to reread, and the second one just didn't have that quite as much. So anyway, for what that's worth.
I agree with that. And per characters, we don't really have, you know, there's different characters living over long swaths of time, like you mentioned. They have interesting names. We'll just go over two things real quick, but you liked...
I really liked, so Hari Seldon is like the guy who's always in them. He's the one who's predicting the future, right? But then in that first book, in the first crisis, we meet a character named Salvor Hardin. And I just thought it was really interesting, good writing, because it sounds like Hari Seldon, but it's clearly a different name. So just like right away, you're like, oh, this is the good guy. Like, cool, I'm on board. I'm on Salvor Hardin's team. I thought that was really smart. And then the second book, there's a woman named Beta, and something really just like funny and coincidental happened with her, right?
Well, yeah, they just... her nickname from her husband is Bay, which was funny when we both had the thought and texted each other that it was like, did Asimov invent the term Bay? See, it just keeps calling her Bay. I mean, yeah, like not yes and no, right?
It just took a long time to catch on. It had to get really deep in the cultural zeitgeist for like 60 years, and then we were ready. Yeah.
We were ready for Bay. And now it's already gone. Now we're already done. So, yeah, it is a science fiction novel. So what is the science? What's the science fiction-y?
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely like part of the old school sci-fi crew who, very much clearly believes that like science and advancements in science are sort of like the drivers of improvements in the human condition.
The golden age of science fiction.
Yeah. And it's a big part of the reason the empire is falling apart is they're like not doing new science or inventing new things anymore. As a great example of this, at one point we meet an archaeologist who like is supposed to be a very like well-respected archaeologist in the empire, like one of the leading minds on this. But all the guy does is read books from other people who read books. Like he's like 8 chains away from anyone who actually did any primary research. And when someone suggests to him, they're trying to figure out where humanity came from. They didn't even know which planet humans started on. And somebody suggests to him like, well, maybe you should go to some of the possible planets and find out. And he was like, well, that's a huge waste of time. Why would I do that? Clearly all the information that you could like glean has been gleaned. So you just need to read books. And I thought that was just a really funny, interesting example of this like lack of new thought, which is a great reason to have an empire decline. So,
yeah, it totally is. And yeah, I found that fascinating too, that all the experts are just what they're experts in is weighing the other previous experts against the other previous experts. And that of course would create this cyclical downturn. And we also see this kind of like the value on from the golden agers on technology for humans progress. We see that in like the trade in some of these books as well. It's like what's valuable in trade is like the piece of tech that's a little better than the last one. It's obvious that humans will want just better stuff. Just help me do my stuff, but better.
Yeah, which is still very much true in the real world. It's just sci-fi is like less
exactly.
about that idea at the moment. But
right.
Yeah,
totally. And I think maybe there's some existential dread about things that humans are doing, particularly in the climate change aspect. So there's a little bit of like maybe technology is bad and can't solve all of our problems. It's like the current zeitgeist, and it just kind of flops back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, I just wish we would. We're very, very bad at dealing with negative externalities, what my economics brain says, and making people pay the real cost of things. Anyway, we don't need to argue about that, but these are solvable problems, and technology can still help us, people.
Yeah, anyway, I agree. Yeah. We also see a lot of how kind of history and societal building is driven by the collective operations of the populace rather than the actions of a few great people. That's kind of like what psychohistory is all about, and what we're seeing here. Like we see the exploration, Asimov's exploration of kind of soft powers and soft sciences and what those mean to society building, and how governments. What I found so interesting about Foundation, the first one particularly, but the whole trilogy, is that he shows how forces like economics and religion, for example, can be used as powerfully and wielded as powerfully as like military might. Yeah, absolutely. I loved all that quite a lot too, as I'm sure you're not surprised to hear that like there are no big men, like we're all the drivers of society is like what I wrote about too. So anyway, should we talk about science and tech maybe? Yeah, I think you loved the atomics.
I loved
the atomic
word
stuff.
Atomics. Yeah, so a lot of times like reading old sci-fi, you just like sort of have to prepare yourself like that it's going to feel a little out of date, and the technology they're going to be focused on is going to feel like not futuristic. not at all the case here, because he did something really interesting. He just painted with a super broad brush and just called a bunch of things with futuristic powers, just like generally atomics. And it totally worked and totally held up. It still feels like, oh yeah, sure, the force fields and the ray guns work because of atomics. Great. Like, sure. And so that lack of specificity almost made it more timeless in a really interesting, great way. So it still feels, there's a few, whatever, we could quibble about some of the science stuff in here for sure. Maybe Trantor should have had some hydroponics on it. But anyway, in general, it holds up really, really well.
Yeah, I think that's another kind of fiction sweet spot, right? Like we were talking about earlier. If you make it specific, like you have a reason for something, but you also make it vague enough and it's believable and you don't need to get into too much detail, then it has a chance of lasting a little bit longer, I think. And then we have, as aforementioned several times, the kind of the crux of the whole foundation, probably the thing he based the entire series on in his mind, the idea of psychohistory, which Dr. Hari Seldon is the progenitor of, to use that word second time in a day, which is the science. It's like the merging of psychology, sociology, and mathematics into one branch of science. And it uses predictive mathematical functions to use in large swaths of population to see where a society will go over time, to predict the path of a society. And that's how Seldon kind of sees that the empire is going to end and sees a way around having the Dark Age last a very long time.
Yeah, that's one that I was really, impressed by. I mean, he was the first one he wrote, like maybe Asimov had heard about computers starting to get used, but like that was so early. It was almost before computers even existed, and he was writing about like predictive modeling and algorithms, which is really impressive. As you pointed out, of course, he didn't foresee that the thing really we would use that for a lot is selling stuff. Of course, that's what we use everything for. So his you can only predict the groups of, the actions of very large groups of people. It's like, well, also maybe you could sell somebody like better pants on Instagram. But anyway, you can't predict it all.
Right. That is kind of a bleak outlook on our own world. What's the bleak outlook of the Foundation world?
Yeah, the one that it's just sort of like, there's just an implicit assumption all throughout the books that like, oh, well, things would be way better if there was a bunch of kings ruling the entire galaxy, right? And it's just sort of begs the fundamental question, like, would it? I'm not so sure. All the kings and dictators keep doing horrible stuff. So that's just sort of like an implicit sort of like bleak assumption in the book here that like the masses cannot be trusted and like you need like a singular point of power who's ruling everyone. And so, yeah, that was a little dark, but it's mostly like in the background. It's like just the implicit assumption of the book. So it's not like hitting over the head with it too much.
Yeah, that it's also kind of a paradox of the book that yields a balance, right? Because as you said earlier, also with psychohistory and the way we see the societies evolve in this trilogy, it's not about the acts of several great leaders, or it's about the movement of humanity as a whole. So we're seeing that that Asimov is saying, well, it would be the Galactic Empire's collapsing and it's going to be Dark Ages unless there's another empire. But also, it doesn't matter who leads that just matters what humanity does as a whole, not who's leading it as an individual.
It's an interesting contradiction. Yeah, as you pointed out, why not just... The tenets of psychohistory do seem to suggest like democracy, right? Like if what matters is what everybody thinks, then everybody could pick who's in charge. But anyway, he didn't, and it's a little dark.
Well, it also just might be a difference in like the real world history and how we felt. Like back then it was a lot of in the science fiction, that kind of era of science fiction, it was a lot of like empire, kings, anointed ones, and people steering the direction of things and ruling benevolently. Like the benevolent empire was the way to do utopia. And I think in modernity we just we don't like, we see through empire. We're like, I don't know. I think we're cynical that it could ever be benevolent. And so we're looking for ways to say, how can we do democracy better? And so I'm not even sure that Asimov using the term empire meant the same thing it would to us.
Yeah, that's true. It is weird though that like all this stuff that was written closer to like World War II and like the greatest suffering that our world had ever seen at the hands of dictators, like they were closer to that than we are. And don't get me wrong, dictators are doing plenty of bad stuff now too, but like you'd think it would be fresh in their minds. Maybe it was just because I don't know. I don't know is the answer, but it's an interesting thing. It's just like
a fantasy and science fiction trope that like, because again, like the empire doesn't feel like he's saying it's the right way to do things to have an emperor. He's just calling it the Galactic Empire, but it really does feel more like, I mean, there's the Trantor as the entire planet of bureaucrats. It does feel more like a democracy almost, or at least closer to a democracy than like a real empire with an emperor would be.
Yeah, but they keep handing down power through generations, which has pretty much never worked for success of good governments.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I guess I'm just trying to parse that, but I do think, yeah, maybe it's just like a where we are in our history thing. It didn't mean the same thing to him.
Yeah, it could be. You noticed something else interesting with the ecumen, right? You want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, I just, I had picked out, obviously you don't see the word a lot. So he describes the Galactic Empire as ecumenical in the book. And obviously in Le Guin's, like Cainish and Left Hand of Darkness, you have the ecumen, the group of humanity's planets. That's like one ruling body. And so I was wondering if one borrowed from the other, or if, where this had come from. The actual literal definition of ecumen or ecumenical is a kind of unity or a collection of specifically Christian churches. So it is interesting that both Le Guin and Asimov chose to use a word that means kind of an alliance of Christian churches, instead of just the word alliance or the word federation or any other coalition, any other word they could have used to describe a unified group of individuals. They chose ecumen. I don't really know where to go from here, but it is interesting.
I mean,
to me.
I wonder if it's because it sounds cool and mysterious, which it does. Like most people, like before you told me that, I had no idea that it had any religious connotations. I didn't really know what it meant. I was just like, oh, that sounds cool. So who knows? But it is interesting. They both did the same thing. Yeah.
Well, if anybody knows, feel free to reach out and enlighten us, because I couldn't figure it out. And it's still interesting to me. And that foundation, it's largely about, what would happen if we all started coasting, specifically the first book, right, Brett?
Yeah,
I'm not sure we have an answer to that either.
It's like the fall of the empire is like everybody in the empire stops trying to like make anything new, and sort of the implicit assumption here is like the key to a lasting, stable society is growth. Otherwise, if there's not growth, then the only thing to do is to fight over the existing pieces of the pie, because the pie's not getting any bigger, right? And that leads to like all these warlords trying to just like control other people so they can have more of the existing stuff. And I think it's an astute, correct observation. Like if you don't continue making the world a better place, then you just start fighting over the scraps. And I think that does. I think he's probably correct that leads to like decadence and decline. And it's a good reminder to us that we got to keep things getting better and
keep trying.
Anyway, keep trying. Yeah. I'll keep trying. No, it's not all coast. So yeah. It's a kind of a happy and pragmatic approach, or worldview, I suppose.
There is a little bit about Asimov that is too bad.
Yeah, he is a reported and self-admitted like creep. While he was alive, he was a sexual harasser, just like full stop. Not great. He even wrote a book called The Sensuous Dirty Old Man, which is like full of disgusting tips, basically. Anyway, fortunately, there's not too much of that in Foundation. The first book is there's like a little sexism in it. The first book, just by omission, it's just all about men. The second book, there's like some implicit suggestions of some like subservience for women in society, although Beta is not doing that, and she's great. And then the third book, there's just like a little bit of creepiness. Anyway, so Foundation doesn't really, like, reading the text doesn't have, it's not like too in your face sexist, but Asimov himself, whatever. Don't go near sensuous, dirty old man, and you'll be fine.
Yeah. There was one more thing we wanted to talk about too, which was hard not to mention the TV series that just came out on Apple Plus.
What did you think of it?
And I thought the TV series was an interesting adaptation. I think a lot of people are kind of hating on it. There's some people hating on it because it's confusing. I don't think anyone listening to this podcast or you would be confused by it. Even if you hadn't read Foundation, you can, we all have the sci-fi chops to deal with it. And then there's some people who I think it's too much of a silly departure, but I like. And then there's some of those typical complaints about like recasting, like you said, the first book is all men. There's a lot of, it's a very diverse cast and women playing different roles like Salvor Hardin, and that,
Are there still people who are upset about that?
I'm sure there are. I'm just assuming there are, and it's totally fine and it's great. And the TV show, I think, is a good adaptation. It's hard in TV, I think, to show, first of all, novels that are just basically conversations between people with ideas in them. That's tough to translate into something that's interesting to watch. And it's also tough to translate to a viewership novel that happens with many different characters over hundreds of years, where you're constantly getting, introduced to a new character while the character you just learned to like is dead for has been dead for 100 years, and so they did that. They did that in a very interesting way, and I thought it was a cool and interesting adaptation and kind of its own new thing. But I liked it, so check it out. Let us know. And overall, Foundation, the first book is one of the greats, and 2 and 3 are pretty good also. They're fun. I think particularly number 2. We liked them, and we hope you do too. Or if you've read them before, enjoyed the discussion. And if you did, we always appreciate it if you wouldn't mind reviewing us or commenting on YouTube.
Yeah, if you're on Apple Podcasts, leave a review, or if you're on YouTube, leave a comment. Got to get those algorithms tuned up. Actually, we've mentioned this a couple times in the last few episodes. And it's starting to work.
Psychohistory.
Psychohistory. No, but it's really working. YouTube has better stats than podcasts. We can see YouTube is recommending our content to many more people, which is great. We can get some organically more people finding out about the show and finding out about more great sci-fi. So it's working. Thanks for doing it. And let's please help keep us. Oh my gosh. We want to keep introducing more people to more great stuff. So yeah.
There you go. Yeah. You were going to walk yourself into a Asimov logic puzzle there. All right. So we have, as always, similar books to recommend. Brent, you first.
Yeah, I'll kick us off. I'm going to highly recommend I, Robot by Asimov. It is a series of short stories all told in his robot universe, they say. But basically all robots have just 3 simple laws that they cannot break, and they're sort of in order of importance. The first law can never be broken. The second law can never be broken except in service of the first law, the third law, on up the chain. And then bad things happen with robots, basically, in each of these short stories. And the question is how can this be happening? How do we solve this problem? And it's always a logic puzzle that is solvable by applying the 3 laws. And so they're really fun, really interesting. They're quick. They're great. Yeah, I really, really highly recommend iRobot.
I thought of Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martinet, which won the Hugo a few years ago. And I thought of it because it's a very similar styling of how we're seeing the action unfold in the book. We've got, it's very much about galactic politics, and the characters, you don't see as much of the action except through conversations the characters are having, kind of behind the scenes in the political back rooms. So I think it shares a lot of commonality with Foundation in that way. And then another one, which we just did an episode on a little while ago, that is an obvious choice.
Yeah, Three-Body Problem and the sequels, which are related because they're similarly telling like the story of a very long period of time with mostly different characters along the way. So yeah, that's definitely a shared feature between them. And that first book in particular is just so good. So anyway, yeah.
And then lastly, another one like that is Canticle for Leibowitz, which is a pretty obvious choice. It's a serial publication, and we've got like different characters that are in very different time periods from one section to the next. They're all different characters out of the three sections. And that's a book we reviewed very early on. I believe it was episode 2 of our podcast, and one that we both just absolutely love. So
yeah, so
you got
great.
four recommendations this time. Otherwise, let us know what you think about Foundation, the series, the TV series. Come visit us for free science fiction books on social media. And until next time.
Yeah, absolutely. Keep reading, y'all. Bye.
Later.